one of the great frustrations of my life talking about politics is the insane myopic focus on the internal problems of the United States versus, say, problems abroad. Because as I've said, with regard to personal relationships, if you've been married a long time, you can look at your spouse. My wife looks at me and she sees all the flaws. It is only when she looks at other guys that she's like, okay, well, I guess I like him better anyway.
To get Brexit.
Make America great again.
No.
Hello, this is Stephen Edginton from The Sun, and today I'm interviewing Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro is a famous conservative commentator and podcaster. He is also an author of this new book, How to Destroy America in 3 Easy Steps. We're going to be talking all about his new book, the woke movement, the 2020 election, and all things Ben Shapiro. Thank you so much for joining us, Ben.
Thanks for having me.
After 4 years in Trump's America, have things got better or worse?
Well, I mean, it's hard to see any area in which America is better than it was 4 years ago, simply because 4 years ago we weren't in the middle of a global pandemic that had destroyed the entire American economy and reduced half the population to dependence on government. But aside from COVID, there are certain areas where America was doing better. I think America was doing better economically, obviously, before COVID. I think that there was at least some pushback on the politically correct notions that had started to prevail early on in the Obama administration. Listen, I'm not going to pretend that President Trump's presidency has been a panacea for anybody. I don't think that's right. I think that the left has reacted to his presidency with a lot more radicalism than I thought they would, frankly. Instead of learning the lesson, which is that you don't call people deplorable racists for disagreeing with you, they've decided to double down on that lesson. And instead of learning the lesson that Hillary Clinton is just an awful candidate, so maybe you ought to get over it, they've decided to blame a wide variety of other factors that have exacerbated a lot of pre-existing divides. In other words, for a lot of the divisions that have been made worse during the Trump administration, I don't actually know that Trump is particularly responsible as much as his presence is responsible and the reaction to him is responsible.
I suppose one could argue that his tweets and things like that have gone to drive, that polarization in American politics, which has perhaps pushed the left to do those things that you've just mentioned.
Certainly agree. I mean, I wish that the president of the United States had dropped his phone in a fish tank long ago. That would have been definitely a very helpful development. But again, I think that there's a sort of metaphor that I've been using for Trump for a long time in American politics, and that is everybody in American politics seems to think that the world began spinning when Trump became president, that no bad thing had ever happened until Trump became president, or alternatively, no good thing had ever happened before Trump became president. For those who believe that the country's become more divided in a lot of ways and the country's gotten worse in a lot of ways, all I would suggest is that Trump is less the murderer than the coroner, meaning his presence on the American scene is really not about him destroying all of the fundamentals of American politics. It's just a symptom of the fact that a lot of those fundamentals had already been destroyed. Has he been instrumental in fixing a lot of that? Absolutely not. Is he responsible for the fact that the dead body was already lying on the street when he arrived? I don't think he's really responsible for that either.
Let's talk very briefly about the coronavirus crisis. Donald Trump obviously, has presided over quite a high death rate if you look relatively around the world. His conflicting messaging on masks, for example, has been criticised. Him talking about injecting, certain fluids and things like that. So can you blame Donald Trump for the mess that America is in now in terms of the coronavirus crisis? Do you think he's handled it well?
So I think in terms of policy, the policy's actually not been terrible. So from the early sort of attempt to ban some travel from China to the ramping up of testing, the United States does do more testing than any other country on an absolute level, to the fact that no state actually went without ventilators. Andrew Cuomo, you can find clips of every major Democratic governor saying that when they called the feds gave them what they needed. All of that has been pretty much what you would expect from any administration. And the failures are probably what you would expect of any administration too. Namely, the CDC completely failed in the early months to ramp up testing. They actually ignored better tests from the WHO in an attempt to pursue their own. There are a lot of mistakes made on the federal level. There were tons of mistakes made on the local level and on the state level, obviously, which is why you've seen a wide differential in death rate. The truth is, nobody really knows how to handle unprecedented epidemic. I mean, nobody knows the answer to this. And as far as the U.S. having a disproportionately high death rate of COVID, the truth is the U.K. has a higher death rate per million on COVID. France has a higher death rate per million on COVID. The United States ranks something like 10th right now. Now, it could get worse. It could also be that Brazil passes the United States. It's also necessary to point out the United States is an enormous country of 330 million people with significant regional differentiation. So when you look at the areas that have been hardest hit, namely New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, about 1/3 of all deaths in the United States happen in the tri-state area. And if you can't remove that population, obviously, from the population of the United States, but that disproportionate impact has really kind of led people to believe that the epidemic has overwhelmed the United States. Well, we're seeing a fairly large spike in places like Florida and Texas. And still, the deaths per million rate for Florida ranks in like number 25 in the United States of all the states. Texas ranks below that. So it's one of the things that I've had trouble with in a lot of the sort of talk about COVID is this assumption that everybody knows the solution. Everybody knows what to do. And if Trump had just done those things, then everything would have been okay. I mean, take masking, for example. There's been a lot of talk Trump didn't wear a mask. Do I think he should have worn a mask? Absolutely. Right? I've been a masking proponent since pretty much the very beginning. When the experts said, don't wear a mask, I was like, okay, they know better than I do, so I guess I won't. And then when they say, do wear a mask, I was like, okay, they probably know better than I do, so I will. You know, President Trump is a stubborn guy, and so he didn't want to take pictures with the mask on. I think that was kind of dumb. But in reality, America masks, as a population, America masks far more often than Canada. All of Scandinavia masks under 10%. So even the basic notion that masks are in and of themselves the cure-all, that's not really right. I mean, there are countries like Spain that have an extraordinarily high percentage of people masking and have a significantly higher death rate than places like Hong Kong, where everybody masks and there are virtually no deaths. So the biggest problem with COVID is nobody really has a handle on it. There are a few things we all know we're not supposed to do. Don't ship COVID-positive people back into nursing homes would be an obvious one. And don't get in close proximity with people while spitting on them would be the other. In the United States, a lot of the stuff that's happened with regard to that has nothing to do with Trump. I mean, shipping people back into nursing homes was an Andrew Cuomo, Gretchen Whitmer thing, and the spitting on each other in large numbers thing. That was happening in the middle of the pandemic with these George Floyd protests, and the media were cheering it on. The media were like, oh, well, apparently if you're woke, the virus just skips right over you. It's like Passover for the Jews, right? You put on the Black Lives Matter face mask and everything is good from now on. It's like that's not the way any of this works.
I suppose his rhetoric, that was quite confusing and different at certain times, playing down the virus, then playing it up, not wearing a mask, then wearing a mask, things like that. That's why he's criticised, not necessarily for, the other things that you're talking about there with the Democratic governors and things like that. I think, that's kind of fair enough. But the president himself, he's got to take responsibility for at least not having a clear message on this virus from the beginning.
Well, I totally agree with that. I will also point out that virtually nobody has been consistent in their approach to the virus. And in early March, New York was basically saying, no, you should remain open. Everything's fine. Don't worry about it. And then by the end of March, they were saying we need to lock everything down. There was significant conflict between the mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, and Andrew Cuomo as far as how strictly to look at this virus. Look, do I think that Trump's rhetorical treatment of the virus has been good? No, I think it's been pretty bad, honestly. But I also think that to take that out of context with the fact that there's been wild vacillations with a number of world leaders, right? I mean, including Boris Johnson. There's been wild vacillation on how the virus ought to be treated and what public policy ought to be. And that's just a reality. The fact is that Trump just says it a lot more bluntly and in a lot more confusing a fashion than I think other world leaders.
Donald Trump is currently about 10 points behind Joe Biden nationally. Most people expect him to lose the election. I suppose most people expected him to lose the last one too. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Is there any way Donald Trump can win? And should he win? Because many people say America is polarized. We've been talking about the state of the nation. It doesn't look fantastic. And Joe Biden could be this unifying figure.
So I doubt that Joe Biden is going to be a unifying figure. I mean, I think that the great tragedy of American politics is that people tend to think that when they win elections, that is actually a mandate for their program, when generally them winning an election is a result of the fact that people hated the other guy. Right? And that's shown by sort of the wild swinging pendulum of American politics. In 2004, George W. Bush wins re-election, and he says, now I've got my mandate, and I'm going to push forward with Social Security privatization and immigration reform. And 2 years later, Nancy Pelosi is sweeping into power. In 2008, Barack Obama enters power with a huge majority. He's got a near supermajority in the Senate. And 2 years later, Republicans sweep back into power because he overreached with Obamacare. I think the same thing is likely to happen with Biden. If Biden is elected, it's going to have very little to do with Joe Biden, who is not an alive human being. In fact, that's mainly the pitch. The pitch for Joe Biden is that he's not alive. I mean, that's actually a pretty solid pitch. And it turns out it's pretty hard to beat a dead horse. Joe Biden is non-threatening to people. People don't perceive him to be a threat to their way of life. They don't perceive him to be particularly radical. They're sort of familiar with him. He's kind of friendly old Joe and all the rest. But if he were to imbibe from the well of Bernie Sandersism, which apparently he is doing, if he's going to bring on Elizabeth Warren as his chief policy advisor, if he selects a Kamala Harris as his VP, then what you could end up with is him winning a very broad electoral victory and assuming that that means a very broad political mandate, which it absolutely does not mean. It would just be a repudiation of Trump. Right? And the same thing sort of happened in 2016. People sort of assumed, well, look at Trump. He must have built this incredible movement. Look at how many people love Trump. wasn't about that. People hated Hillary Clinton. She was the least popular candidate in American history. And right now, the least popular candidate in modern American history is the incumbent president of the United States. So the idea that everybody's going to kind of unify behind Biden, nobody's unified behind Biden. People just don't like Trump very much in the United States right now by public opinion polls.
Are you getting in your excuses early? That's what it sounds like to me. If Biden wins by a landslide, maybe he does have a mandate to do the things that he was elected for.
Well, I mean, but the question is, what was he elected for? Remember that he beat Bernie Sanders in the primaries specifically by being not Bernie Sanders. So then to take on Bernie Sanders' entire program is kind of a bizarre move. Is there a mandate for Bernie Sandersism because Donald Trump has a 35% public approval rating? That's a hard pitch to make. And as I say, that's not unique to Biden, right? I mean, I just mentioned Bush and Obama in the same exact context, this sort of misinterpretation of public approval for you personally or public disapproval of your opponent as we approve every element of the apparently unspecified Biden mandate. Like, Biden has been pretty smart in not making a lot of mistakes here. Right? So he was asked about defunding the police. He said, I'm not in favor of defunding the police. He was asked about taking down statues. He said, I'm okay with taking down Confederate statues. I don't want to take down Columbus, Washington, and Jefferson statues. Right? These are largely kind of middle of the road, popular positions on these issues. But his radical base is not in agreement with him on that stuff. So the question is, what policy does he push? And if he pushes those moderate policies, then sure, I guess he could be a more unifying figure than we've seen. But do I trust him to push those unifying policies? Or do I think that the organized base of the Democratic Party, especially if they regain Congress in its entirety, would they be likely to push him pretty far to the left in a way that Americans aren't particularly fond of?
I want to ask one more question before we get on to your interesting book that I've been reading about the 2020 election. And you mentioned some comments, I believe they were on Fox News, where you were reacting to a poll which says that 56% of Americans believe that America is a racist country. Now, you described this poll as shocking and devastating, and you said that those people who believe that America is an institutionally racist country, they just want to destroy society from within. Now, my question to you is, can you believe, surely you can believe, that America is a racist country and not want to destroy it, but want to improve it?
Well, the question is the definition of racist. So what we've seen over the past several months is the redefinition of the very term racist. So originally, the term racist used to mean that you believe in the innate inferiority or superiority of a particular racial group, right? That was the definition of racism. The commonly used definition of racism has radically changed in the media, and this is due to sort of the work of Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, where they say this explicitly. Any system that results in any racial inequality is a racist system. And if you're complicit in that system, then you are now complicit in racism. To be anti-racist means to oppose the system. So definitionally, according to their calculation, if you are anti-racist, that means to, quote unquote, oppose the system. When I say that 56% of the American population thinks that America is institutionally racist, what I have said, and I said this on my podcast when I discussed this in a little bit more depth in Not 5 Minutes on Fox and Friends, is that it depends on what you mean by institutionally racist and systemically racist. So that's a very vague kind of weaselly term because people don't tend to get very specific about it. So if you, I believe the actual poll question is, do you believe American society is racist? There are a few different ways to read that. Do you believe that your friends and neighbors are racist? If you believe that your friends and neighbors are racist, that America, broadly speaking, the people you know are racist, you got a real problem on your hands because it means you really don't like the people that you live with in a country. Okay, that is really disunifying. If you believe that America's institutions are racist, you're going to have to explain which institutions are racist and how they are corrected. And you can't say that those institutions were historically racist. That's a different argument. The question is American society racist today? Not were the police racist in 1960, not were colleges bigoted in 1930, not were Jim Crow and slavery bad. We all agree on these things, right? These are 100% propositions. The question is which institutions are supposedly discriminating today? And there, people tend to be incredibly vague, and they tend to just attribute any inequality to inequity. They conflate disparity with discrimination, as Thomas Sowell puts it. If you believe that any system that results in a disparity is therefore discriminatory, there is no way to correct that system. The system itself is deeply flawed because every single system human beings have ever created results in some sort of disparity between groups.
Do you think you're being a little bit divisive by sort of grouping these people with, the majority of Americans who believe that America is a racist society by saying that, these people simply want to tear down these institutions? Well, I'm sure many of them, as I say, lots and lots of people out there supporting Black Lives Matter, for example, might just want to improve on those institutions, and they see the death of George Floyd and other examples of, racism, and they might want to improve on those things. And you say actually they want to destroy them.
If I did, then I apologize. I don't think I said that 56% of Americans want to destroy the country. I said it's indicative of the destruction of the country if that many people believe this. Meaning, I don't think I attributed to every single person who answered that poll question, you want to destroy the country. I think that's a misstatement of my statements. I'd have to hear it back, but if I did say that, then obviously let me amend that now.
I've got the full statement here. You didn't say that. You made a distinction that you believe that your friends and family are racist, or you believe that society is racist. And if you believe that society is racist, then you want to basically tear down society and destroy it. That's what you said.
Right. And what I did say on my podcast is that there are a lot of people, I think, who answered this question believing that if they answered differently, then they would be intimidated into silence. And this is some other polling data that's come out this week, is how many Americans are afraid of saying what they think is true because they're deeply afraid they're going to be canceled. So if a pollster calls you up and says, do you think American society is racist? And you say no, then you're very much afraid that there's going to be some sort of societal blowback to that. Do I actually really believe that a majority of Americans think that society, broadly speaking, is racist? I don't, because I don't think that when you ask people specific questions like, do you think your friends and family and neighbors are racist? They answer yes. I think it's an easy answer that allows you to escape censure from cultural elites to say American society is racist, specifically because it is so broad and you don't actually have to blame other people.
Let's talk about your book. I've got it here. How to Destroy America in 3 Easy Steps. Now, you paint 2 visions of America that are completely contrasting, and you call it Unionism versus disintegrationism. Unionism, that's basically, your view of the world. It's the view that America is an imperfect nation built on fundamental values, on rights. It is a beacon of hope. It is a beacon of freedom. It has liberated literally billions of people around the world throughout history. The other vision, as we've talked about already, is that America is deeply corrupt. America is an institutionally racist society with roots in slavery and oppression, which is still persecuting minorities today. How can we have such conflicting visions? And so many people, we talk about that one poll, 56% of America believing their society is racist. How can we have such conflicting visions? Surely there must be some truth in both of them.
So I don't think there's truth to the broad-scale narrative. I think that what happened here is that there was indeed a whitewashing of American history that happened for generations, where people refused to acknowledge the downsides of American history. And people who responded to that, instead of correcting American history and saying the overall thrust that American history is good and is attempting to rectify breaches in the founding structure, that overall thrust is right, but we have to acknowledge the downsides of American history and the cruelties and the evils. Instead of being a corrective, it's been treated as a full-scale replacement. I mean, this I openly discuss in the book. Instead of Howard Zinn being read as a sort of compendium, as a sort of answer to a traditional whitewashed version of American history, Howard Zinn is now read exclusively. And that's how you end up with the perverse view that America is rooted in evil, as opposed to America has, in fact, experienced great evil, and evil people have at times held the helm in a wide variety of capacities. But that does not mean that the story of America is that its fundamental principles are evil or that its fundamental institutions are evil. The contention of the 1619 Project is that literally all of the institutions of the United States are rooted in slavery and bigotry, and therefore essentially ought to be torn down. You can attribute everything from disparities in maternal mortality rates to traffic patterns to economic imbalances today entirely to racism and historically racist structures. That is a far cry from a mere corrective to American history. So much of politics really is a sort of reactionary bouncing between points. So you certainly understand why people would react to a whitewashed American history that pretended that everything that happened in American history was good, with everything in American history is bad. But American history is a lot more bad than good, and the thrust of American history is more toward the solidification of the principles of unionism that I talk about than the disintegrationist principles that are currently being pursued. So I guess if the question is, should we recognize a more nuanced version of American history? Absolutely. I mean, if you read my chapter on what I call sort of a unionist history of the United States, I think I'm fairly explicit in the book about all the flaws of American history, ranging from slavery to Jim Crow, the heroism of Black Americans in overcoming these extraordinary obstacles to become literally the most successful Black people on planet Earth, the attempts to rectify breaches in the constitutional structure. I don't make light of the mistreatment of Native Americans. Nobody should overlook the evils of the past. What we should recognize, if we are going to contextualize history and be honest about it, is that human nature is inherently sinful, that human beings everywhere at all times have been sinful. The question of America is whether America has been a force toward the vitiation of that sin, or whether America has been a force toward the deepening of that sin. And I think it's a pretty obvious answer.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, I suspect that you think that most Americans agree with you and most Americans are unionists. If this is the case and, they basically support you in terms of your views on the value of, fundamental rights, the Constitution and things like that, Why do so many people support the Democrats? You talk about the Democrats a lot in this book. You mention Democrats who, support this disintegrationist philosophy. You talk about Nancy Pelosi and AOC and all these other figures. Why do so many people support the Democrats? A lot more people at the moment supporting the Democrats than the Republicans, for example, who might be the kind of people defending unionism.
Because I think the great arrogance of people in our particular line of work is the belief that most Americans or most Britishers or most people around the world think deeply about political philosophy. I really don't think that that's the case. I think the vast majority of people, when they go to the ballot box, they're basically voting for whichever candidate they kind of have a feeling about and kind of like the most. Very few of them are reading deeply into the works of Woodrow Wilson to see the philosophical predecessors of Nancy Pelosi. Very few people are reading the works of Frantz Fanon to understand the foreign policy of Ilhan Omar. Right? Very few people are actually looking at the ideological forebears of politicians. Politicians are very rarely looking at their own ideological forebears. So using sort of how people vote as a proxy for what people think about deeper underlying issues, I think this is the point, which is why we have all of these idiotic little culture wars on the surface of our politics, whereas the real underlying issues are a lot deeper, but very few people are discussing those, obviously.
Do you think that some people could read that as slightly patronizing? Most people don't agree with me because they simply haven't read up on the issues.
No, I mean, I think that that's just a fact. I think most people have better things to do than sit around reading political philosophy. Right? I'm lucky enough to get paid for the privilege, but most people have lives to lead. And also, there's a general perception in the United States that there is sort of a background level. This is one of the big flaws in just human psyche, is that there's a fairly large-scale assumption that status quo is status quo and will never change. And so there's an assumption of prosperity and freedom in the United States, of a law-abiding civilization that is never on the verge of chaos or collapse. And that's just the normal. And so you can always just stray from the normal, but the normal is still there. And so politics don't really have that much impact on most people's lives in any serious way. And you can see why people believe this. I mean, they elect Democrats, the government grows. They elect Republicans, the government grows. Not all that much changes on a practical day-to-day level for most Americans. Most Americans tend to view politics more like entertainment than they do view politics as something that makes a big difference in their everyday life. And I don't think that they're necessarily wrong to do so, except over a broad span of history that may not be reflected in every two-year election.
Reading this book, and I think you've written it before the COVID crisis, before the Black Lives Matter protests, it makes me, from an objective point of view, I think that you've done a pretty good job in predicting some of these kind of riots and protests and a huge amount of polarization in American society and society all around the world. So can I ask you, where do you get your crystal ball from, and what's going to happen next?
So I think that human nature is a pretty good crystal ball. As long as you have in mind a pretty decent idea that and it's very easy to recognize, human beings are capable of great sin and human beings are capable of great good. And if you grant people too much power, they tend towards sin rather than great good. If you get rid of checks and balances, bad things happen. And people have a tendency toward a certain level of ingratitude toward the past. People have a certain level of sanguinity about things continuing to be the way they are. And so they tend to be a little bit more experimental than perhaps is good for them in terms of public policy. You're seeing this right now with the defund the police movement and the very, very predictable response by villains to go and criminalize and commit criminal acts. When you look at the United States and what you see is a population that is relatively disengaged with political philosophy and the roots of the country. And then all you see in terms of the media are these very kind of hot flashpoint stories where you're demanded to believe a particular thing about that. And you're not just even about that story, about a narrative that is to be drawn from that story. The actions of people are fairly predictable from that point of view. So, like, if somebody had told me that there would be rioting in the streets over George Floyd, I wouldn't have found that particularly shocking, considering there were riots in the street over Michael Brown in 2014. I mean, nothing has fundamentally changed, except that people are a lot more pissed off and a lot more bored because of COVID. And so I don't think it took a crystal ball to say, it's less proscription, it's less looking forward than it is sort of describing what was happening in the now. It was just that the final veneer hadn't been torn off, and with COVID and with the Floyd protesting and then the attendant looting and rioting by a semi-small percentage, then you saw sort of the final veil fall away.
Obviously, we've got an election in November, and that will have a big impact, I'm sure, on American life and society and the media and everything like that. But maybe even putting that to one side, and you can comment on it if you like, where do you think America is heading? What's going to happen next?
Well, it seems like the divisions are getting deeper. It looks like the left wing of the Democratic Party has gained an awful lot of power inside the Democratic Party. Right, Nancy Pelosi last year was basically trying to crack back against the squad, against AOC and Ilhan Omar. And then President Trump, being a man who always leaps in with both feet where angels fear to tread, immediately attempted to divide Pelosi from Omar and AOC, which of course led Pelosi to embrace both Omar and AOC. You've seen the Democratic Party come very close to nominating basically a communist in Bernie Sanders. Somebody calls himself a democratic socialist, but has never had a bad word to say about a communist regime anywhere on planet Earth. That the Democratic Party came very, very close to that. So I would expect that would be exacerbated. Biden was supposed to be the stopgap. I think that a lot of people are hoping that he's the stopgap, that he'll come in. There'll be a certain level of restoration of calm. It'll be sort of a 1920 Warren G. Harding return to normalcy. All of this craziness calms down and I think for a few minutes it will. I think for a few minutes, the media will stop with this sort of open stoking of chaos. I think the media's treatment of the public situation the last few months has been extraordinarily egregious, worse than pretty much any time I can see in my lifetime. We're watching actual violence go down in the streets of Portland, and the media assuring us that nothing is happening in the streets of Portland. We were told by members of the media that mass protests in the middle of a pandemic were not a danger to anyone, so long as the protests were for the proper public purpose. That sort of stuff is just malpractice. I think that if Biden were to be elected, the media would go back to its feeling of, again, sanguinity, of a certain level of, okay, well, everything's going to be okay. Trump's out. This is never going to happen again. And then I think the next step is going to be whether that sort of feeling consolidates and everybody says, okay, well, I guess we can go back to normal and treat each other decently again and recognize that was kind of a crazy period. Or whether, as I think all politicians tend toward their leftmost or rightmost flank once they believe that they have been empowered to do so. And instead, what you see is Joe Biden trying to be a world beater, the most progressive president since FDR, as Sanders has put it. And you see these divisions further stoked. It also depends on the margin of the victory, right? If it turns out that Joe Biden absolutely blows out Donald Trump, then it means that President Trump essentially goes away, right? He might be out there and he might be making noise, but it's hard to be the leader of a party after you get blown out by 10 points and 200 electoral votes. If, however, the election is very, very narrow, things are going to get extraordinarily dangerous very quickly because there are going to be a lot of people, no matter how it goes. If Biden loses in a close election, a lot of Democrats are going to feel like they were cheated. If Trump loses in a close election, he is undoubtedly going to stoke the flames of a belief that he was cheated out of it. And beyond that, even if he loses in a narrow election, he then sticks around and snipes from outside he's not going to be a president who goes away and enjoys his retirement. He's going to stick around, and the divisions are probably going to widen. So I see a lot. Let's put it this way: I see a lot more pathways toward additional chaos after a short delay and a sort of national taking of breath than I see a long-term pathway toward unification.
I want to talk about history. Now, this is a really interesting topic in your book. At the moment, and it's really current at the moment, you've got statues being taken down all around the world, people questioning our past, our collective past in Britain and America and all across the West. People are saying that our societies are, steeped in racism and slavery and these terrible things that happened in the past. And some people are saying, well, actually, this is the same thing that happened in China with the communist cultural revolution, where they started, from year zero. George Orwell talked about this, the wiping out of history. But at the same time, I kind of have this instinct that, if I was a Jewish person and there was a statue of, I don't want to go, take this too far, but if there's a statue of, let's say, Hitler or someone from the Nazi party and they'd oppressed my people in the past, I can kind of understand why that would be offensive. And if you're a black person, maybe you find it offensive that there are slave owners and statues of those that are still around today. So there's this kind of interesting balance, I guess, that we've got to have. And I think you were really nuanced in the book, talking about the bad things that happened in the past and the good things. And overall, you say America was a force for good in the world. Where do you think that's heading? Do you think that overall the story of America is slowly disintegrating? Do you think the story of America in young people's minds today, because most people who are young probably disagree with you on this, is basically being eroded away?
Well, I mean, there was a poll stat from that same Wall Street Journal poll that I found more troubling than the "Is American Society Racist?", which, as I've said, I think a lot of people answer that question yes, just because it's an easy answer, and then people leave you alone. The more telling statistic is, were the American founders heroes or villains? So if you're above the age of, I believe it was 40, then 71% of Americans believe the founders were heroes, and only 10% believe they were villains. If you're below the age of 30, then the stats were like 31% villains, 39% heroes. And the rest don't know. That's a pretty dangerous stat. And the reason that's a dangerous stat is if you believe that the people who founded the country were not heroes for founding the country, then I don't know what to tell you. Here's the thing. All human beings are flawed and sinful. This is just the nature of human beings. Robert George, who's a professor of ethics over at Princeton University, had what I thought was kind of a hilarious thread where he talked about teaching an ethics class at Princeton and asking all of his students, okay, You are a citizen of Alabama living in 1840s Alabama. How many of you are abolitionists? And every single hand in the class goes up. And he says, oh, really? Oh, really? Right? You're the only good people who've ever lived in history. Your morality is so free-floating and a priori that you have been able to devolve your entire moral system from nothing. And you could be plopped down at any time in history, and you would be in favor of same-sex marriage, and you'd be anti-slavery, and you'd be for malleable gender identity, right? Like any time in human history. It's such an ignorant perspective on what human beings are and how moral values tend to evolve over time, and how a lot of values that we find despicable now were not nearly as seen as quite as despicable hundreds of years ago. I've said before that I think every statue of Barack Obama in 100 years will come down because he ate meat, right? I mean, I think that as moral standards evolve, people are going to think, okay, well, who can we go after from history? Here's my view of statues, and it's pretty simple. Is the statue to the person put up because they did a good thing or because they did a bad thing? Not is the person who the statue is of, was that person overall good or overall bad, right? That's a decision mainly for God. But if the decision is, was the statue put up to honor a good thing the person did, or was the statue put up to honor a bad thing that the person did? And here you can make a pretty easy distinction, right? So if you put up a statue of Robert E. Lee because he was a great Confederate commander, that was a bad thing he did, right? He was a traitor to the United States in leading the Confederacy. If you have Washington and Lee College, which is named after Robert E. Lee in his capacity as president of Washington and Lee College, then you are honoring him for being the founder of Washington and Lee College. It's a different reason to put up the statue, right? There's a little bit of nuance and complexity here. If you're putting up a statue to George Washington, no one puts up a statue to George Washington because they're like, I love the way he treated the people that he never should have owned, right? I love that. That's just one. Nobody thinks like that. In the same way, I've suggested that there are statues to Martin Luther King. There's excellent evidence that Martin Luther King was horrible toward women, horrible in his personal life toward women. Does that mean all the statues come down? Of course not. That's not why we have the statues up, right? When we think of Malcolm X and Malcolm X's late perspective on conciliation between the races, there's a reason people honor him for that. Nobody says, okay, well, we can't honor him because he was a pimp. He was a pimp. Okay, but that's not why we honor him, to pretend that every figure from history must be evaluated as a whole person, not by historians or not by you or me talking about them in their sort of wholesome, full human nature. But when you look at a statue, the statue has to come down because this person did a bad thing I don't approve of 200 years later. It's the height of moral arrogance, and frankly, I think it's a load of stupidity.
Do you think this kind of historical revisionism comes from a sort of easy way to rewrite your own story? So I'll give you an example of this. There's a lot of talk in Britain, and George Orwell even talked about this, of intellectual elites hating the UK, hating England. I think there's some famous quote from George Orwell saying, in no other society do the intellectual elite despise their country so much as in England. And many people say the reason for this is because other countries and other peoples like to write their own stories. And in those stories, the UK is generally the bad guy. You know, they've gone and they've colonialised Ireland or the US or wherever it is. And those people have been able to liberate themselves from British tyranny. You know, you talk a lot about British tyranny in your book. Do you think the same applies to America, where certain groups, ethnic minorities, for example, are trying to write their own history? And when writing that history, they've got to have a bad guy, and that bad guy is America. So is this kind of a convenient way of rewriting other people's history where America is just the baddie?
I mean, I think there is some truth to that. And listen, I think that if you are writing African-American history and you look at the history of America, there's certainly plenty to pick on. But it's also important to note that the successful civil rights movements in American history have been based on the notion that America was founded on something good and didn't live up to the promise. I mean, this is exactly what Frederick Douglass said. This is exactly what Martin Luther King Jr. said. That is the good history of America does not ignore the bad things that happen. It recognizes that America has failed to live up to her promises, which is an absolutely fair critique. Now, when it comes to the kind of generalized dissociation you see from Western elites, now this is a term that I first saw used by Shelby Steele, the black writer at Hoover Institute, in a book called White Guilt, and it's applicable, I think, more generally. And that is a lot of successful peoples in the West, a lot of successful nations. There are elites in those nations that feel guilty about that level of success, and when flaws in the nation are pointed out to them, they say, I don't want to be associated with that. So the easiest thing for me to do is to announce my own guilt, and then I've reestablished my own moral authority. So on the issue of race, what Shelby Steele says is one of the reasons you see sort of white woke leftists do this routine where they say, I've internalized my white guilt. I mean, you saw these bizarre pictures in the early days of the George Floyd protests of large numbers of apparently upper-class, elderly white people literally kneeling in front of black people. That is not an act of humility. That's an act of arrogance, because what you're actually doing is saying, I have now apologized on behalf of all white people. Everyone who disagrees with me is still racist, but I'm not racist anymore. Not only that, I've accepted upon myself the the white man's burden of having to fix the society because you, the black person, you've been deprived of agency by this entire system. I understand. I've been born with my white privilege, and I have to use that privilege to remake the system. So, I mean, it sounds humble. It is actually the most arrogant thing you can say. You're depriving other people of agency. You're saying you're better than other white people. This is what Shelby Steele says. He's exactly right. You're saying you're better than other white people, and also that you have more power and more agency and should have more power and more agency than black people themselves, which is an insane contention. You see this more broadly with the West. You see a lot of people who sort of say, well, I accept that I'm part of a Western civilization that's really bad, but I'm no longer that. I'm a member of the world, right? I'm a world citizen standing above and beyond my own nation and above our own history. My morality stands apart from all of that, but I understand that because I've been privileged with this much power, I have to use it to correct the system. So you just sit there and watch as I fix the world. And it's like, well, that seems to me, you seem like the least qualified person to fix the world if your perspective on the world is that you are capable of fixing it.
I think one of the most interesting points that some people make is that the same people who say that the Western culture, America, Britain, wherever, are deeply racist societies, deeply corrupt societies, are the same people, and they, by the way, they say we focus too much on the West and we're too Western focused, but at the same time, they don't care about or don't speak about modern slavery that's going on all around the world. They don't talk about a genocide in China against Uyghur Muslims. Their kind of cultural relativism only applies to the Western world. So what do you make of this kind of hypocrisy?
Well, again, it's much more comfortable to give yourself moral authority by criticizing members of your own society than it is to criticize anybody who's outside that society. Because if you were, this is one of the great, one of the great frustrations of my life talking about politics is the insane myopic focus on the internal problems of the United States versus, say, problems abroad. Because it's, as I've said, with regard to personal relationships, if you've been married a long time, you can look at your spouse. My wife looks at me and she sees all the flaws. It is only when she looks at other guys that she's like, okay, well, I guess I like him better anyway. Well, the fact is that if you look at your own civilization that way, if all you do day in and day out is try and spot the flaws in your civilization to the point where the United States is now having conniption fits over the name of the Washington Redskins or whether there's a product at Trader Joe's called Trader Jose's, if that is the granular detail that you are going into to try and identify vestiges of racism in American society, and meanwhile, there are literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people being held in abject slavery and sex slavery around the world, and people being shipped by train. We have video of it. People having their heads shaved, shipped by train to concentration camps to work as slave labor or to be sterilized or both. Then you're just doing it wrong. And it's also bad social science. I mean, it really is bad social science. You'll see people in the United States talk about the gap between black and white in the United States and attribute it to evil American systems. Very similar gaps by percentage exist between black and white in terms of income and wealth in places like Canada. They exist in places like the UK. This is true in terms of health disparities as well. I was talking with someone here about maternal mortality rates. And they were saying, well, maternal mortality rates for black women are much higher in the United States than they are for white women. And I said, well, that's also true in France. It's also true in Britain. Right? There are significant differentials by race in terms of maternal mortality. So is that a result of the American system? It seems like you need to actually have some comps in order to determine what the independent variable is. It doesn't appear that the independent variable here is America.
The idea of unionism and the unionist philosophy is one you posit of working with human nature. For example, you talk about the idea that fundamental rights and values, everyone is equal under the law, and that those values are sort of enshrined and are above kind of humanity. Does the current woke/disintegrationist philosophy remind you of how the communists in the 20th century tried to organize societies and tried to organize humans and tried to make everything perfect with their kind of governmental control of various ways that we live our lives?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there was an amazing graphic that was put out recently by the National Museum of African American History and Culture in the United States, which is a Smithsonian institution. I mean, it's paid for by tax dollars. And this little graphic, which was supposed to be about whiteness in American society and white supremacy in American society, it described qualities like the following as white qualities. These are all things that are apparently unique to white culture: individualism, hard work, delayed gratification, punctuality, and the notion of intent as an element of a crime. Okay, well, like, all of those things are not unique to white people. Are you insane? Right? There are plenty of black people and brown people who believe all of those things because they should be fairly self-evident. Treating people as individuals is a better thing than treating people as members of groups. Hard work, that seems like that should be a thing for pretty much everybody. How about delayed gratification? What I mean by delayed gratification is the only factor in leading to success for anyone who has ever been successful in human history is a certain element of delayed gratification. The notion that punctuality is like a white people thing and that it's just a weird white standard. And finally, the notion that intent as an element of the crime, that matters. I mean, that's pure insanity. And you see this play out in terms of how the media like to cover particular crimes in the United States. The idea is that we have to not adjudicate cases based on their fact pattern. We have to adjudicate cases based on their narrative. It's very important that we adjudicate cases based on their narrative. This became very obvious, for example, in a lot of the coverage with Brett Kavanaugh. So Brett Kavanaugh is accused of raping a woman 30 years ago, 40 years ago. The woman's count, Christine Blasey Ford, turns out to have zero evidentiary backing. But there were actual columns written about how Brett Kavanaugh getting angry at what was, in his opinion, being falsely accused of rape. His very anger was a sign of his white privilege. The fact that he was cracking back against people who were suggesting that he was a rapist was a sign of his white privilege. And the fact that he was white and the fact that he was wealthy and privileged growing up, this meant that we needed to treat him differently in the justice system than we needed to treat other people in the justice system. That's pure full-scale insanity. You see this on a broader level when you look at the media coverage of particular race cases. So what you'll see is that there will be a cover of Time magazine, and it will treat every single incident that is bad in which a white person hurts a black person as absolutely equivalent despite the fact pattern. So they'll have on the cover of Time magazine a picture of George Floyd right next to a picture of Michael Brown. Those fact patterns are in no way similar. The George Floyd situation is a situation where every single person who watched it, who I've ever met, looks at that and says that's an act of police brutality. I've yet to meet the person who doesn't think that's an act of police brutality. The Michael Brown scenario is a scenario where by witness testimony, a black man reached into the car of a police officer, tried to grab his gun, fired the gun, took off down the street, turned around and charged the police officer before being shot in the front. Okay, that is not in any way the same, but the idea is that because the races of the cops and the victim in one case, alleged victim in the other, because the races were similar, that means that the actual fact pattern was similar. Well, if you believe that, then you're a nut. I mean, that's not just nuts. It's a terrible idea. You can't judge people based on race that way. I can't imagine a moral standard being built on that.
Now, you mentioned there before about your wife talking about your flaws, and America. You talk about America's flaws, and everyone's flawed. And cancel culture, this is something that many people talk about now, doesn't allow for flaws. You're not allowed to have a flaw. That's a crime now. If you have any flaws, if you make any mistakes, then you must lose your job. You must lose your way of life. What are your flaws, Ben? And how have we got to this point where making a mistake or having a flaw, is a crime?
I mean, my flaws are probably the same as a lot of other people's, but maybe uniquely so. I tend to speak strongly and sometimes over strongly about points, and then I have to think more about them and maybe make them more nuanced. I'm somebody who tends to I would say I've taken a lot of crap, but I think nobody ever has thick enough skin to deal with all the crap that is thrown at them. And so I sometimes allow that to sort of infuse how I live outside of my job, which is a flaw for sure. I think that, like anybody else, I'm subject to confirmation bias. And so I have to try and constantly challenge my own confirmation bias. Right? All of these things are true. Also, other flaws. I've written stuff that I don't agree with. Right? Famously, in Britain, right, I was quizzed about some of the stuff that I'd written in the past. And guess what? I wrote bad stuff in the past. I've acknowledged I wrote bad stuff in the past. And you can either, hone in on that, or you can let it go because I've apologized for the stuff I don't like, or I haven't apologized for the stuff that I still agree with. And that sort of is what it is. But the cancel culture is a culture without redemption. It's a culture without any sort of grace. The purpose of cancel culture is to cancel. It is not to gently chide somebody into considering their opinion more broadly. I have those conversations with people on the left literally every single day. I mean, I have many, many friends on the political left in the United States, and we're constantly sort of bouncing off of each other and having in-depth conversations about these issues that I find, very often useful and informative, and sometimes they change my opinions or make them more nuanced, and that's great. But cancel culture is not about that. There's also a difference between people criticizing you and cancel culture. And I think that proponents of cancel culture like to conflate the two. So we should be very careful about that. If somebody criticizes me, that's not me being canceled. If somebody goes after my advertisers because they don't like something I said, that's being canceled. If somebody suggests that I be taken off YouTube, as Kara Swisher of the New York Times once suggested to Susan Wojcicki, the head of YouTube, that's an attempt to cancel. Me being canceled on a college campus, that's being canceled. The truth is, cancel culture isn't really aimed at people like me. Thank God I make a really good living. I'm very secure in my perch here. I own my own business, so tough, deal with it. But cancel culture is really directed at the guy who works for Deloitte and Touche in the mailroom. And he has to worry about if he says something, he's going to lose his job because the cost to the corporation of losing that guy is very close to zero, but the cost of that guy of losing his job is extraordinarily high. Cancel culture isn't really directed at the top level figures. so much as it is directed at intimidating everybody else.
I'm glad you mentioned that interview in Britain. Now, if for viewers that don't know, and I've been asked to ask you about this, so many people in the UK watch this interview with Andrew Neil. Now, Andrew Neil, he works for the BBC. He does some fantastic. He's probably the best interviewer Britain has, I think. Most people agree with that. But he also is the chairman of The Spectator, which is an extremely right-wing, I mean, really right-wing magazine. Now, you did an interview with him. He was pretty hostile, which he is to all of his guests. But your immediate reaction was to call him a lefty. Do you think this was sort of one of your flaws? Is, immediately painting someone that disagrees with you or is asking a kind of pretty, nuanced, balanced question as a left-wing person? Maybe they aren't. Maybe they're just someone asking a simple journalistic question.
So I will say that, I still challenge the notion that a lot of those questions were particularly nuanced, since he was essentially just reading me bad old tweets. But the big flaw there, and that is a flaw, is I should have done my research. I had no clue who Andrew Neil was. Obviously, I found out pretty quickly, right? Like a lot of guests of Andrew Neil's have found out. So if you exist in the American media context and you don't do a lot of overseas interviews, the way the American media tend to operate is asking questions like Andrew Neil was asking, but suggesting that they are objective, that these are all objective, purely objective questions, when it is fairly obvious that the reason the question is being phrased in such a way is to elicit a particular response. Right? That is very common on CNN or on MSNBC. So my assumption was that it was the same with regard to Andrew Neil. Obviously, that's not the same, right? Andrew Neil, as I learned not only during that interview but in later research, his deal is to sort of play devil's advocate and ask everybody tough questions, which if I had known, I would have treated the interview very differently. So that was a flaw on my part. There were a couple of flaws that were exposed in that particular interview. So that was one of them, was assuming that I knew who he was. I had no idea who he was, or that assuming that because I didn't know who he was, that he must not be prominent. That, of course, is idiotic. The other thing that I did there was I made a sort of ego play, which you should never do. Right, assuming that the reason that he was coming after me is because I'm prominent. He comes after everybody, so obviously that was foolish. And I was appropriately chided for that. I mean, I acknowledged literally the day that the interview came out that it was a bad interview, and I acted late and I acted poorly during the interview. Now, do I think that it is my obligation to stick around for 20 minutes of somebody reading bad old tweets at me? I really don't. I mean, whether it's coming from right, left, or center, I think that is a bad interview tactic. I still disagree with the generalized interview tactic of here's everything bad you've ever said, now justify it in 30 seconds or less. I think that's not a good interview tactic. But if that's a shtick, that's a shtick. I should have known that going in, and I should have acted appropriately.
Why did you step back? Now, recently, viewers might not know this, recently you stepped back as editor-in-chief of the Daily Wire. Why did you do that? Are you preparing for your 2024 run, or are you going to be Kanye's running mate for this year, or what's going on?
God forbid. All that happened there is that as my time on the podcast expanded, I do 3 hours a day now. I have books, I have speeches, I have a lot going on. When I first started Daily Wire, I was literally assigning every single piece that was written. I didn't read every single piece that came back in. I had managing editors, but every single title was assigned from me directly, or at least 90% of them were assigned from me directly at the beginning. So I was very, very hands-on because we were a small website. As the website has grown, and it's an enormous, enormous website at this point, I just was not acting in the capacity of editor-in-chief. I rarely checked the website. I really was not editing pieces. I wasn't even really overseeing the editorial content of the site. I was writing a piece once in a while. And so one of our managing editors, who had been writing under a pseudonym because he was a professor at a university here and didn't actually want to get fired, he had actually stopped working as a professor. And so we went to him and we said, do you care about like coming out from behind the pseudonym and writing under your own capacity and taking credit for what you're actually doing, which is effectively editing the site on a day-to-day, so we can be more clear with the public, who exactly is greenlighting pieces and who is not. Because what would happen is a piece would go up, and then I get an email like, why did this piece go up? And I'd be like, I have no idea why that piece went up. I haven't checked in on the site for a week. So it creates more transparency and more accountability. And it also allows us to solve the problems more quickly so that all the complaints go to the right party.
I mean, I had some other ideas of what you might be thinking about doing. I mentioned there 2024 Ben Shapiro. I mean, I think that'd be pretty popular. Maybe Kanye's running mate this year? No? Fox News host? None of those things?
As I said, live by the Kanye, die by the Kanye. As far as Fox News hosting, I did host an election special with them during the last election cycle. It was fun. We had some talks about doing a weekend show. That wasn't something that I really wanted to do because I'm already working 5 days a week full time, and working 6 days a week full time I think would be very difficult for my family. But yeah, no, I appreciate the thought.
Well, look, I think one of the most important questions I really want to ask you before you go is slightly personal to me, but I think millions and millions of young people all around the world have seen your videos on YouTube, and they've definitely made us think, at least, to question certain ideas and values that you might see in the mainstream media. And Jordan Peterson, another fantastic one of these figures. They talk about the intellectual dark web, who's given hope, I think, to a lot of young, especially young men who might feel purposeless in their lives. They might think that they have no meaning in their lives, and they feel that maybe they've gone to university. Now, I didn't go to university, but maybe they go to university and they feel that everyone around them is left wing, and if they speak out, then they're going to get cancelled, or they'll have problems with making friends or even getting a girlfriend, or whatever it is. You're in a position, hopefully, to give them some advice. So what would you say to young people today who agree with you, who've read your book and think actually every single word is fantastic? What do you say to them who are a bit afraid to speak out?
Well, what I've always said to people is that you really should think seriously about when to speak out and when not to speak out. So I think that caution is sometimes warranted. I mean, it really does depend. You have to be realistic about the situation that we are living in the world. And you have to be realistic that there are, unfortunately, consequences, depending on your industry and what you do, to speaking out clearly. And so you really have to calibrate which conversations are worth having and which ones are not worth having. There's an argument I've had with my friend Dennis Prager. So on the college campus level, I'm asked a lot. So I'm a conservative in a liberal professor's class or a lefty professor's class, and the professor really doesn't like me speaking out. Should I continue to speak out in class? And I've always said, well, I don't know why you would give the professor the power to give you a bad grade and ruin your academic career in order to make a point to the professor. Dennis has always been like, nah, just say what you want and let the chips fall where they may. I'm not a chips fall where they may kind of guy. I don't really like giving enormous amounts of ammunition to people who really are poorly intentioned. And very often that is the case, unfortunately, in public life. So what I've recommended to young people is stay away from social media. I've learned the hard way that if you are writing or tweeting at a very young age, it does not matter. People will come back at you 20 years later with stuff that you tweeted when you were 19 years old. And it will live in infamy forever, no matter how many times you say, well, I was 19 and that was kind of dumb. So if you can avoid that, avoid it. There really is very little upside to being on social media until you really feel that you are clear in your thinking. You should really think about your circle of friends and family in terms of who you wish to spill your heart to. That doesn't mean that you can't have people who disagree with you, you spill your heart to. You just have to understand that they have to be trustworthy, because we live in a time where there is a lot of hay to be made for people in sort of exposing even friends, for sort of public view. And we've seen a lot of these sorts of cases, and it gets really ugly really quickly. I wish I didn't have to suggest that everybody be quite so careful about what they say, but I also understand, where we are at this point. And, the reason I'm out there, the reason there are a lot of other people who are, like-minded out there speaking out publicly, is specifically to make these ideas more well thought of and more tolerated in public life, presumably across the West, so we can actually have these open conversations. I was gratified to see that, things I've been saying about cancel culture for literally years. I mean, I'm talking about like a decade at this point, maybe more than a decade. I talked about it in my book, Bullies, in 2012. The cancel culture, I'm glad to see that there are some liberals who are finally coming around to the idea that cancel culture is bad. That letter in Harper's Weekly I thought was quite encouraging. The next step is for some of those members of Harper's Weekly to actually acknowledge that the Overton window does not stop at Andrew Sullivan, that the Overton window actually extends to, for example, mainstream conservatism. I thought it was amusing the Harper's Weekly letter didn't have one signatory who had voted for Trump. I mean, that it would have been a much more powerful letter if people would do that. And that's sort of what I'm hoping for. I've talked before on my show about what I call the happy birthday problem. I have lots of friends who are liberals, people on the left, very, very prominent folks in the mainstream media. And every time I have a birthday, I will get a bevy of texts from them saying happy birthday. And then on Twitter, nothing, right? Because if they acknowledge I'm a human, they get canceled. That has to stop, or we're all going to have to be extraordinarily careful about what we say for the foreseeable future.
Listen, I want to ask one more question before we go. You have one of the biggest platforms in America in terms of Facebook. I mean, the Daily Wire is absolutely huge. The reach it has, the engagement it has is far higher than CNN or the New York Times. So you've got this huge platform, you've got your radio show, you've got your podcast. What's your ultimate goal in life? What drives you? What's the plan?
I mean, it's less of a plan and more of a message. And that's always been true for me, is wherever I can get the most people to listen to the message, I will go. And so if that means that I go on Joe Rogan's podcast and I'm friendly with Joe, then great. And if it means that I do a BBC interview and get destroyed, then that's fine too. Wherever I feel like I can go to spread the message and hopefully do the research before the interview, then I will go. And so that's sort of the goal. And we've spun up an enormous business here, thank God. A lot of people resonate to the message. We are hoping to expand that into different fora and different arenas and take that message into different areas of American and international life. I can't talk too much about those plans because my business partner might literally murder me. I'm famous for sort of revealing too far in advance
on.
what we're going to do. I famously promised there would be a Shapiro store on the Daily Wire website for 2 years in advance of there being a Shapiro store. So I'm hesitant to do that again now. But let's just say we have some big plans, and hopefully we'll roll them out in the near future.
Fantastic. All right. Thanks so much, Ben, for joining us. That was a fantastic interview.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.